Hello chaps, Paul Curran here. I hope you and all the listeners are well. It's been a while since the last Poetry Corner, but I have been busy. One occasion of note that stands out was reading a couple of my poems along with other people prepared to read their work at the Stratford, I want to say Civic Hall. I think it's called the Arts Centre, the Playhouse now on Rother Street. That was a very enjoyable evening about a week or so ago, notable for an elderly gentleman who'd written a poem the previous week on the subject of his great uncle and the cursory standard letter that had arrived announcing his death at the Somme. That was very moving, and a bit of levity was introduced by a busker who was in attendance, and he was singing of his troubles with being moved on by the officious powers that be at New Street Station. Anyway, this week I have been reading and thoroughly enjoying some of the poetry of Clive James. Clive James has been mentioned on Poetry Corner in passing before, but I really have been struck by how masterful his verse is, and also I've been struck by his assertion, which I believe to be correct, that form is vitally important when hoping to write poetry that's of any value. And yes, of course, the meaning is essential, and his work is notable for its clarity as well as its diverse subject matter. The poem that I'm about to read is taken from his 2012 collection, Nefertiti in the Flak Tower, which is also the title of a poem therein, which discusses the bust of Queen Nefertiti, one of perhaps the wealthiest queen of ancient Egypt, and how it's withstood bombardments during the war in Berlin, where it's housed. Clive James, though, his dates are as follows. He was born on the 7th of October 1939 in Australia. He's 79 at present, still with us, and he was educated at the University of Cambridge, Pembroke College, and the University of Sydney. His real name is Vivian Leopold James, followed by the initials AOCBE FRSL. Of course, he's known as Clive James, and he's an Australian author, critic, broadcaster, poet, translator, and memoirist, best known for his autobiographical series Unreliable Memoirs, for his chat shows and documentaries on British television, and for his prolific journalism. He's also known for his dry wit, I'm sure you'll agree, and that pervades in his poetry, which also has a plaintive quality. This later work, that's true to say. Anyway, I'll continue with this now. I don't think I need to say any more about it, other than the French quote below the title. It's sorry, bear with me. It's called A Perfect Market. The poem's called A Perfect Market, and the French below it is Ou plutôt les chanteurs, which translates loosely as, or rather sing them. And I imagine, I'm not entirely sure, but I imagine that's a quote from Ronsard, who he mentions in the first line. Ronsard was a French poet known by his generation as the Prince of Poets. I believe he lived in the 16th century. I'll double check that. Pierre de Ronsard, born on the 11th of September 1524, and he died on the 27th of December 1585. So his life had a long life for that time, and it overlapped with Shakespeare's. This is A Perfect Market by Clive James. Recite your lines aloud, Ronsard advised. Or even better, sing them. Common speech held all the rhythmic measures that he prized in poetry. He had much more to teach, but first he taught that. Several poets paid him heed. The odd one even made the grade, building a pretty castle on the beach. But on the whole, it's useless to point out that making the thing musical is part of pinning down what we're on about. The voice leads to the craft to art. All this is patent to the gifted few who know, before they can, what they must do to make the mind a spokesman for the heart. As for the million others, they are blessed. This is their age, their slapdash in demand from all who would take fright were thought expressed in ways that showed a hint of being planned. They must say anything, in any way. Why not? Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? Nothing to study, nothing to understand. And yet it could be that their flight from rhyme and reason is a technically precise response to the confusion of a time when nothing said once merits hearing twice. It isn't that their deafness fails to match the chaos. It's the only thing they catch. No form, no pattern, just the rolling dice of idle talk. Always a blight before, it finds a place today, fulfills a need, as those who cannot write increase the store of verses fit for those who cannot read. For those who can do both, the field is clear. To meet and trade their wares, the only fear that mutual benefit might look like greed. It isn't, though. It's just the interchange of showpiece and attention that has been there since the cavemen took pains to arrange pictures of deer and bison to be seen to best advantage in the flickering light. Our luck is to sell tickets on the night, only to those who might know what we mean. And they are drawn to us by love of sound. In the first instance, it's how we sing that brings them in. No mystery more profound than how a melody soars from a string of syllables. And yet this much we know. Ronsard was right to emphasize it so, even in his day. Now it's everything. The language falls apart before our eyes. But what it once was echoes in our ears as poetry, whose gathered force defies even the drift of our declining years. A single lilting line, a single turn of phrase, these always proved, at last we learn, life cries for joy, though it must end in tears. I'm sure you will have been able to detect in that reading of Clive James's poem how tight the language is, the form, the internal rhymes, and the meter. It's really an excellent work on the subject of the abandonment, perhaps, of the disciplines that he believes, as Ronsard did, are a prerequisite for writing good verse. An excellent poem. I hope you agree. That's called A Perfect Market from Clive James, Nefertiti in the Flak Tower. Well, with form in mind, and perhaps with Pembroke College, Cambridge in mind, let's turn briefly to Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray, whose dates were 1717, I believe, certainly published his most famous poet in 1751. Thomas Gray was born on Boxing Day, 26th of December 1716, and he lived until the 30th of July 1771. He was an English poet, letter writer, classical scholar and professor at Pembroke College, Cambridge. He's widely known for his elegy written in a country churchyard, which was published, as I say, in 1751. Gray was an extremely self-critical writer who published only 13 poems in his lifetime. despite being extremely popular, he was even offered the position of Poet Laureate in 1757, though he declined this. Well, it's not actually the work of Thomas Gray that I intend to look at this week. Hopefully there'll be time for that in the future. It's just that really his poem is an elegy only in name. After I'd been looking at Clive James's work, I returned to my second book in particular, where yes, there are some sonnets there, and the sonnet will always be a wonderful challenge, but I also attempted to write using different poetic patterns. The elegiac couplet in English is made up of a hexameter followed by a pentameter, to put it technically, which is a line of 12 syllables followed by a line of 10. Pentameter we're familiar with from the looking at sonnets and Shakespeare. Much of the writing in his plays is written using iambic pentameters. Coleridge put it far better than that when talking about the elegiac couplet, for he says, in an elegiac couplet, this: in the hexameter rises the fountain's silvery column, in the pentameter I falling in melody back. The form was felt by the ancients to contrast the rising action of the first verse with the falling quality in the second. It was first used by the Greek lyric poets for a variety of themes, usually of a smaller scale than the epic, adopted later by the Roman poets Propertius, Tibullus, and Ovid. So we have a longer line followed by a shorter line, hexameter followed by a pentameter. Well, I had attempted to use this form when I wrote a poem in my second book. It's called 2 Years and 10, or L, not elegy, L being the Roman numeral for 50, of course, and this is for Larry, as and when. 50 is a tax-free MGB, a thatched roof, an age no longer needing any proof. A few passing crazes, a political phase, a little more than 18,000 days. Centre of a century's belt, the buckle brass lacrimae rerum shine for all times past. Boundary bound, if belted true and uncaught, caught, on cracked leather as of the belt, one ought catch revolving legend, repeating, slowed by tuft, scratched near to missing stitches, scrawled and scuffed. For sure, 10 and 20 is not too poor a haul, when thinking 50, but a cricket ball.